So today we'll be focusing on ESG, and Josh has prepared an amazing presentation with amazing speaker Clara Eisenberg. So you're in for a real treat. Let me just click the next slide. So just to give you a brief overview and some general housekeeping, as you may be aware, this session is already being recorded. Everyone online, thank you for joining us. I know there's a few of you today, so I hope you've enjoyed the session as well. Facilitators have already been briefed, so thank you very much for volunteering for that. It's always a very integral part of the conversation to have facilitators. And we do have a photographer, Madeline is here. If you really don't want your photo taken, please put your hand up and we will know to respect your boundaries and not get photographed. So no one has expressed their objection to that, so snap away. And we'll post some of the photos on LinkedIn after the event. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Josh, who has done all the work. You're going to have a great time, I'm sure.
Hopefully. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me through the lapel mic a little bit? I don't want to scream. Cool. Well, look, firstly, good evening. Thank you to Legal Voices for letting me run with this one, and thank you all for taking the time to hopefully come and learn something useful. ESG is extraordinarily topical in many cases for all the wrong reasons. It is a framework that businesses, that the finance industry, that the legal industry, and the insurance industry in particular, and I think the role of insurance in all of this is always forgotten, is increasingly having to focus on. The problem is that ESG, for a fairly innocuous three-letter word, is actually really, really complicated. And the vast majority of people, including lawyers, including general counsel, including boards, actually get quite nervous when ESG enters the conversation. And that is part of the challenge. Environment, social, and governance seems straightforward enough, but actually it's a huge topic. I have been a solicitor for about 8 years now, and one of the things that I particularly enjoy about this job is the unexpected conversations, right? We've all been there in a room with a client talking about subject A, and they're going, oh, by the way, can I just ask you whilst you're here? And then they will throw you some sort of curveball. So for a little bit of fun, I'd like to invite you just to close your eyes and imagine that you have just finished a 2-hour meeting with one of your most important clients about something that has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with ESG. And being a diligent trainee or diligent associate, take them to the lift, brought them down the stairs, and the doors open, and you step inside at the 46th floor and you push the ground floor button. And as the doors slowly close, they turn to you and say, oh, by the way, I've been asked to come to a meeting of our ESG committee later today. I know that it stands for Environment, Social, Governance, but what is it? And you have until you get to the ground floor to some sort of answer that will engage them in the discussion, right? Take a moment and think about how, if you would have any idea where to start, you might go about trying to answer that question. And I suspect you might find yourself casting around a little bit in your mind for a useful starting point. So I'm going to try and help over the next 25 or so minutes give you a better understanding of, if I can go back, what ESG actually is, where it came from, and really critically, and I think this is where a lot of people go wrong, how you can explain ESG in a way that connects with your audience. And on that topic, if you take just one idea from this session today, please let it be this. By show of hands, who's read Braiding Sweetgrass? Cannot recommend this book highly enough. I see some big smiles out there. It is one of the best books that has been written in this space. Of about 100 lessons that I took from this wonderful book and actually wrote down in a little scrapbook that I keep, this one really stuck with me. To be heard, you must speak the language of the one you want to listen. Robin Will Emery, make sure to pick up a copy of this book. I feel like I'm presenting the weather. This is so big. The reason that those of us in this room have assembled today is generally because we are worried about climate change, right? We are focused generally on in ESG. We are particularly focused on greenhouse gas emissions. We are focused on pollution. We are increasingly focused on biodiversity, and we are worried about what is happening to the natural world around, right? And I get that. Here's the problem, okay? The vast majority of people who sit on the boards of corporate companies and the vast majority of lawyers, including general counsel, are not particularly familiar with environmental issues. It is not a safe and comfortable space for them. They have some familiarity with some of the issues that fall under the social bucket because there are laws that have been making them think about these issues for a little while now, particularly health and safety, particularly minimum wage, right? But they get governance, right? They understand governance because governance, as we're going to see together, has been around for a while, and it has always been a fairly core part of what boards have been asked to get involved with. So they understand concepts like business values, ethics, and culture. They understand shareholder rights. They understand board composition issues. Thanks to GDPR, they've all had some proper training in data protection issues. And because of the Bribery Act, they understand anti-bribery and corruption. So what I'd like to encourage you to do, think about opening a conversation of ESG, even though you naturally gravitate towards, by focusing on those things that are familiar to your audience, to speak to them in the language that they need to be spoken to, which means finding a way to hook their interest by leading off not with the environment piece, even though that's what gets us passionate, but by focusing on social and governance issues. And thankfully, there is a way to do it. So I'm going to tell you the story of ESG. I'm going to tell you where ESG actually came from. And to do it briefly, and I'm going to miss a lot of important steps in the story because otherwise we'd be here until tomorrow night. We're going to go back just briefly 100 years. So if you go back to 1920, the economy is booming, right? Everybody is getting in on the stock market. People think it is an easy gravy train to free money. If you can't afford to invest in the stock market, that's not a problem because your stockbroker will actually lend you the money, right? And on the basis of this belief that the value of the stock market would just continue to go up ad infinitum, businesses had raised huge amounts of money very, very cheaply. And they had produced far more than the economy actually needed. And as all of us know, in October 1929, the whole lot came crashing down, and it crashed down hard. You can see what happened on the graph here to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And the Great Depression that followed lasted until World War II came along to kickstart the economy once again. In fact, it wasn't until the mid-50s that the Dow Jones actually got back to the point that it had previously reached in 1929. And as people were trying to analyze what had happened here and how it was that this had occurred, people came to understand that amongst other things, what we had seen in the 1920s is essentially wildly irresponsible corporate conduct. And a concept started to be discussed, which at that time was referred to as the social responsibilities of the business. Today, we call it CSR. CSR is, of course, a familiar topic to most boards and most counsel. In 1953, an economist called Howard Bowden, who is broadly considered to be the father of corporate social responsibility, wrote this book, The Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. And at page 5 in the introduction, he wrote this. I think it's really striking that this was written in 1953. On one thing we can be definite: the unrivaled freedom of economic decision-making for millions of private businessmen, which characterizes our free enterprise system, can be justified not if it is good merely for the owners and managers of enterprises, but only if it is good for our entire society, right? We have a tendency to think of this concept as a relatively modern concept, the idea that businesses should act responsibly, right? It's been around since the 1950s over in America. And what he coined was this definition of the social responsibilities of businessmen as the obligations of businessmen to pursue those policies, to make those decisions, or to follow those lines of action which are desirable in terms of the objectives and values of our society. So it's as early as 1953 that we have this concept of what we would now call corporate social responsibility. And outwardly, at least, it was popular. People were interested in it. Senior business leaders were talking about it, and they were on board. This is a series of extracts from a set of interviews and lectures that McKinsey hosted at Columbia University. And you can see, just to pick one example, the corporation, like society itself, is a congregation of human beings. And like society itself, it prospers to the extent that the relationships it maintains are fruitful, harmonious, and mutually beneficial. So just hold in your mind for the moment that as far back as the 1950s, we've got this concept of what we would now call corporate social responsibility gathering steam in America. Over the next 10 years, environmental issues start to come to the fore. In 1962, Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring. That book went on in the 60s to sell 500,000 copies in 24 languages around the world. And actually what it really was a deep dive expose on the use of DDT, which for those who are not familiar was an industrial insecticide, which was finding its way into food chains and causing problems far beyond just getting rid of the insects that it was intended to target. This book awoke a real consciousness, particularly in America, about the impact of industrial chemicals and got people talking about environmental issues. It actually triggered legislation that ultimately saw the use of DDT banned in America. And it was one of the factors that led to, in April 1970, the first Earth Day protest. I love this photo. Science is actually useful. Who knew? So we've got this concept of corporate social responsibility. We've got an increasing awareness of it. And it's in that context that actually we get what I think you could now refer to as the first anti-ESG backlash, right? I said to you before that ESG is front and center of the news these days, and occasionally for the wrong reasons. A large proportion of the criticism that you see of ESG today broadly comes back to what Milton Friedman, a very famous economist, wrote in an essay called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits" in the New York Times Magazine in September 1970. He said, what does it mean to say that business has responsibilities? Only people can have responsibilities. A corporation is an artificial person, and in that sense, it may have artificial responsibility. But businesses as a whole cannot be said to have responsibilities, even in this vague sense. To be fair to Milton Friedman, he has something of a point. I don't agree with it. He has something of a point. In a free enterprise private property system, a corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. That thinking was quite seminal in the 1970s. There was just one big problem that would soon be revealed, which was that contrary to what Milton Friedman said, businesses, it turned out, were not conforming to the basic rules of society, those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. In 1972, there was the Watergate scandal. And in the series of investigations that followed that event, the United States, particularly the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, started to uncover quite an extraordinary amount of corporate bribery and corruption. In the report that brought everything together in September 1977, they noted that more than 400 corporations had admitted to making questionable or illegal payments. The companies, most of them voluntarily, when they were offered essentially a form of amnesty, have reported paying out well in excess of $300 million, remember this is in the 1970s, in corporate funds to foreign government officials, politicians, and parties. And that was a problem for many reasons, but two in particular that were on the front page of the news. Remember that this is the 1970s. Remember the broader political environment. If capitalism is being seen around the world as corrupt, that is good for communism. And that's not okay as far as the American politicians are concerned. The other one is perhaps more on brand. Companies don't record bribes in their books accurately, right? And the politicians became concerned that people were making investments based on sets of accounts and annual reports which were inaccurate. And we got two things that really came out of the Watergate scandal. The first was that in 1976, the term corporate governance first appeared in the Federal Register of the Official Journal of the Federal Government of the United States. Corporate governance, as a broad term, is the great-grandparent of the governance that we now see in ESG, and it has been around since 1976 in some form or another. What also happened was that at the same time in 1976, at the request of the SEC, the New York Stock Exchange amended its listing requirements to require that listed companies have an audit committee, one of our important parts of our governance of ESG, composed of independent directors. The other thing that happened is we got the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977. This was the world's first proper anti-bribery and corruption legislation. It had two broad provisions. Firstly, provisions that made bribery of foreign government officials illegal. And secondly, a books and records provision, requiring that companies maintain and keep accurate books and records. We know from the way that the history books have played out, and this is my bread and butter, this is the white-collar crime work that I have predominantly been doing for the last 7 years, that often, of course, companies don't keep books and records in an accurate and complete way. And actually, what's interesting from a practitioner perspective is it tends to be the books and records provisions that catch these companies out. They don't get caught paying the bribes, but they get caught not maintaining books and records the way that they should. But I digress. 5 years later, in 1982, and against this backdrop of an increasing environmental consciousness generally, the United Nations is becoming concerned about the speed at which we are working our way through the planet's allocation of natural capital. And they commissioned in 1982 a report that came to be known as the Brundtland Report, which was published in 1987. And I think the introduction speaks for itself. It reads as follows. Many present efforts to guard and maintain human progress, to meet human needs, and to realize human ambitions are simply unsustainable in both the rich and poor nations. They draw too heavily, too quickly on already overdrawn environmental resource accounts to be affordable far into the future without bankrupting those accounts. They may show profit on the balance sheets of our generation, but our children will inherit the losses. We borrow environmental capital from future generations with no intention or prospect of repaying. They may damn us for our spendthrift ways, but they can never collect on our debt to them. We act as we do because we can get away with it. Future generations do not vote. They have no political or financial power. They cannot challenge our decisions. And amongst so many things that this report did was it gave us this concept of sustainable development, which we still use to this day. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And in support of this, the International Chamber of Commerce came together in 1991 and issued the ICC Business Charter for Sustainable Development. That gave us guidelines in 8 categories to which businesses were asked to sign up. Sustainable development as a business priority, inclusive economic growth and development, environmental responsibility management, responsibility towards people and societies, and at number 7, transparency, communications, and reporting. Can you start to see the hints of ESG forming in that framework, right? We've got corporate social responsibility, we've got corporate governance, we've got anti-corruption legislation, we've got an increasing awareness of environmental causes and issues from the Earth Day protests. Now we've got this concept of sustainable development, and it's starting to come together. Back over here in the United Kingdom at the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, unfortunately, things are not going very well. Politicians are worried about an increasing lack of investor confidence in the honesty and accountability of companies because a slew of very large, well-known international companies that were based in the UK were going bust weeks or months after their auditors had given them a clean bill of health. And that led to many things, but particularly it led in 1992 to the Committee on the Financial Aspects of Corporate Governance, which was chaired by a gentleman called Sir Adrian Cadbury, developing a set of principles of good corporate governance, to use the term that the SEC had first used back in '76. Those principles were incorporated into the London Stock Exchange's listing rules and introduced the principle of comply or explain, which is a concept that we still use in many sets of regulations today. It was the world's first corporate governance code, And at that time, the recommendations focused particularly on the control and reporting functions of the boards. And once again, you'll recall the similarities to what happened in America on the role of auditors. 1992 was an important year for many reasons. The world comes together in Rio. And amongst so many things that happened at the Rio Earth Summit, we do, of course, get this, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the foundational treaty that gives us the basis for COP. The world is starting to wake up to corporate governance. The world is starting to wake up to environmental issues. We're starting to try to figure out how to do something about it. And 5 years later, we have our first proper go at some sort of agreement to reduce globally the scale of our carbon emissions. The Kyoto Protocol ultimately didn't work. It failed, it fell flat. But it was a proper attempt to come together and start to really focus as an international community on these issues. The other thing that we got is the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals are the forerunner to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I expect most of you are broadly familiar with. But you can see from the sort of eight boxes that they fell into, they're largely focused on social and environmental issues as we see them today. We start to get closer to the mark in the year 2000. Kofi Annan is the UN Secretary General, and he realizes that if he's going to shift the needle on all of these topics in some sort of useful, meaningful way, he needs to get the business community to come together and focus on them. And he suggests at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 1999 that the global business community initiate a global compact of shared values and principles to give a human face to the global market. And the global compact came into effect in July 2000. The global compact describes itself as the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. And it was organized around 10 principles, which increasingly look like the ESG that we see today. Human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And this was good. This was a good start. This was positive progress. Unfortunately, once again, things keep going wrong. In the year 2000, the dot-com bubble bursts in exactly the same way as the Wall Street markets crashed in the 1920s in America. People have been speculating on the basis that something will continually go up. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't, and everything goes wrong. Enron then collapses in the year 2001, and overnight, $63 billion disappears in one of the biggest corporate frauds in history. And it's back to the drawing board for Kofi Annan and the Global Compact. And in 2004, they come up with this report, Who Cares Wins, Connecting Financial Markets to a Changing World. Kofi Annan realizes that if you want to get the business community to focus on a particular issue, you have to get the finance community in that issue, because where money flows, business follows. And in the introduction, they write this: the importance of actively managing risks and opportunities related to emerging environmental and social in combination with rising public expectations for better accountability and corporate governance presents a new set of challenges. The financial industry has begun to acknowledge the importance of such issues. Until now, the industry has not developed a common understanding on ways to improve the integration of environmental, social, and governance aspects in asset management, securities brokerage services, and the associated buy-side and sell-side research functions. We therefore believe that this is the right time to provide the industry with better guidance on ways to improve the consideration of environmental, social, and governance issues in investment decisions. And that right there is the first time we get the term ESG, a United Nations report. That is where it came from. That was the context that it arose. It was an attempt to get the finance industry to focus on driving capital towards businesses that took these topics seriously. And they followed up with the Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI. So in 2005, Kofi Annan invited a group of the world's largest institutional investors to join a process to develop a set of principles for responsible investment. The PRI's mission is as follows: we believe that an economically efficient, sustainable global financial system is a necessity for long-term value creation. Such a system will reward long-term responsible investment and benefit the environment and society as a whole. The PRI will work to achieve this sustainable global financial system by encouraging adoption of the principles and collaborating on their implementation, by fostering good governance, integrity, and accountability, and by addressing obstacles to a sustainable financial system that lie within market practices, structures, and regulation. And these are the 6 principles of the PRI. You can see the first 3. We will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis and decision-making processes. We will be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into our ownership policies and practices. We will seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by the entities in which we invest. This is all about getting the finance community to integrate ESG decisions into, ESG factors into their decision-making processes in a bid to get the business community to therefore focus on those things, because they know that if they focus on those things and they can demonstrate that they are focusing on those things, they will get investment from the finance community. And it gets off in 2006 to a slow and modest start, if I can put it like that. I suspect those of you sitting at the back might not be able to see it. It's all the way down on the floor over there, but there's a handful of owners, a handful of signatories, and a handful of assets under management. And it grows slowly and steadily at the start for several reasons, not least because in 2008, of course, we had the financial crash, right? We've had this concept of ESG since 2004, and it turns out businesses are still not acting in a responsible way. They are still not being properly run. Their books and records are still not accurate. And as we all know too well, the world suffered the consequences. And the scandals kept coming. The corporate scandals kept coming. To pick up on one which is slightly more relevant to this audience, our interest in climate change, we had the Volkswagen emissions scandal in 2015. But then 2 things happen, which, if I go back slightly, really kickstart a focus on ESG from 2015 and particularly 2016 onwards. The first is that in 2015, we get the Paris Agreement, an agreement amongst the 196 nations of the world subscribed to COP to try and hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and an agreement to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. That gets people really thinking and talking about climate change in a way that they just hadn't been doing. The other thing that happened was this. Larry Fink, for those who are not familiar, is the chairman of BlackRock. BlackRock is the biggest asset management owner in the world. Mr. Fink is a slightly controversial figure, again, in the climate change space. But let's not focus on that for now, because what he did here was really important. Since 2012, Larry had written an open letter to the business community. And it's always quite a big deal in the business community and the asset management community. And he had never previously, until now, mentioned ESG in one of his letters. But in 2016, he writes this: generating sustainable returns over time requires a sharper focus not only on governance, but also on environmental and social factors facing companies today. These issues offer both risks and opportunities, but for too long, companies have not considered them core to their business, even when the world's political leaders are increasingly focused on them, as demonstrated by the Paris Climate Accord. Over the long term, environmental, social, and governance issues, ranging from climate change to diversity to board effectiveness, have real and quantifiable financial impacts. At companies where ESG issues are handled well, they are often a signal of operational excellence. BlackRock has been undertaking a multi-year effort to integrate ESG considerations into our investment processes, and we expect companies to have strategies to manage these issues. And that, if I was to try and pick just one thing that had really caused engagement with ESG and the PRI to really take off in 2016, would be Larry Fink's letter. So let's try and bring it all together. I set out to answer the question, what is ESG? Where did it come from? And how can you explain ESG in a way that connects with your audience? Bearing in mind that when you push the door on the lift and the door's shut, your audience is probably an in-house lawyer who is not particularly familiar with any of these topics. This is my best suggested 30-second answer before you get to the ESG is a combination of corporate governance and corporate social responsibility. Those are both terms that are familiar to your audience. It was originally designed in 2004 as a set of criteria to encourage the investment community to direct capital towards businesses that were environmentally and socially conscious and well run, to encourage businesses to focus more carefully on those issues. Today, the term ESG is used much more broadly, and the intended meaning often changes depending on who you are speaking to. But generally, ESG is used as a framework by the business community to structure and describe their efforts in each of these spaces. And in addition to being focused on by the asset management industry as it was originally designed for, ESG performance is now also considered by regulators, by insurers, by bankers, by customers, by employees, by activists, by the press, by civil society, by legal voices for the future, and beyond. And that gives you 30 seconds worth, I hope, which makes sense, which critically is expressed in a language that is meaningful and useful to your audience, which doesn't lead as much as we will want to with the environmental piece that will send most of them running for the hills because they're scared of it and they don't understand it. And hopefully, we'll give you a chance to then say, of course, when the doors open, let me know if you'd like a longer conversation about this on another. And 99.9% of those lawyers will go, yeah, I think I would. That's when you've got time to think. That's when you've got time to bring in whichever messages you would like to bring in, particularly as we all care about the environment piece. Do you all hopefully feel a little more confident that as and when a situation like that arises, and I promise you at some point in your career, a quick-fire question about ESG will arise, do you feel slightly more confident having a go at answering it? Cool. Then I can stop talking. And I can welcome to the podium Clara. Do you want to just mic yourself up? So whilst Clara mics herself up, and before I ask her to introduce herself, I should say that I met Clara in December last year, yep. I think. And we've had several good long chats since then. And when the idea of doing this session came up, and I was thinking about who I might like to invite along, Clara came to my mind, and I told her that we would be having a fireside chat. I should hasten to add that I didn't promise it would be a warm and cozy fireside chat. So let's see how this goes. Clara, thank you so much for coming and joining us. Perhaps you could just begin by telling us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I mean, I guess before I do that, I just want to say genuinely thank you all for coming, because you know, we really have a problem in the world today. A lot of people are ignoring it, and it's very heartening to see you all here and think that there is a new generation that cares about this and it's going to work, because we are going to need a lot of good lawyers to do something about these existential, very real problems we have. So yeah, thanks. It's great that you come out. So I don't have a background in ESG or sustainability. I did a pretty traditional route into law. I qualified at Clifford Chance. I was a corporate finance lawyer. I mean, there were kind of environmental lawyers then, I remember, but it was, you don't think about it in terms of like oil spills and like nothing with us. And then I went to a US firm. And then again, I was sort of corporate and commercial. I then took a sidestep. I set up as a consultant, which led me to become a director at Jazz FM, Jazz Station. I ran a jazz festival. And then I decided to come back to law, and I went in-house at June London, the high street footwear retailer, which I hope you're all familiar with. Very good shoes for men. And then I'll tell the story in a second of how I got sustainability, but I mean, it was a pretty standard kind of general counsel role. And I'm now involved with carbon reduction and measurement in hospitality. So I'm kind of pivoting now more into a role in a business that is doing something to help some of these issues that Josh talked about and we'll talk about tonight.
Brilliant. So let's go back then. You've got this general counsel role.
Yeah.
How did you get involved in sustainability?
So I think I've been there probably 3 or 4 weeks, and the CEO said to me, we need to do this modern slavery policy. And I was like, okay. And I looked at the modern slavery policy, and it had been written, I'm going to say, by a lawyer at a law firm, quite a respectable law firm. And I thought I better do some research on this policy. And it suddenly dawned on me that it was the new Modern Slavery Act. And it was supposed to be a slavery statement. And you were supposed to do one every year talking about, how you'd eliminated the risk of there being modern slavery in your supply chain. And I looked at this policy and I thought, good Lord, like it was written a bit like, you shall not do this and you shall do this. And it had nothing to do with reducing the risk of slavery in the supply chain. And that sort of opened up a can of worms, and I had to be quite brave and go back to the CEO and say, this is a policy and great that we have this and lovely, but this is what we're supposed to be doing. So that was my kind of, and it literally was a can of worms, because I then had to start reading about it. Questions like, I went back and said, do we map our supply chain? And the answer was, oh, we know our supply well, they've been supplying us for 30 years. And it really mushroomed you, because you really can't start reading about this stuff without getting more involved and starting to care about it.
So sustainability was not a topic that was previously familiar to you. You had your entry point with modern slavery, which actually I've heard a lot of general counsel mention. How did you educate yourself? What were the tools and resources that you used to become more familiar? And which of those topics did you particularly focus on, given how broad and confusing it could be?
So I think the reason that lawyers maybe got to this point through modern slavery was it was probably the first bit of legislation in the UK that impacted private companies. So, I mean, there's still, despite what lots of lawyers like to send out in newsletters to their clients, there's still relatively little legislation which is really guiding small and medium-sized private companies in this country, which is why it's kind of, you've got to go on for business reasons. So I guess that's why I kind of went to the supply chain first. But what did I do? Well, first of all, for a high street footwear retailer, I wanted to look at what competitors were doing. And then I started to learn the language, started to understand that most people were couching this in terms of people and planet. So that was a good place to start. So a lot of reading. I looked at, what our competitors were doing. There's a hell of a lot of stuff out there. Thank God for the internet, not like when I started, I didn't go to the library and sort of find articles. I listened to a lot of podcasts. I suppose the good thing was I was able to focus my learning on, retail and apparel and footwear. So I had, it's a vast area, isn't it? So I was able to sort of focus on that. And I think once I had this kind of concept of people and planet, then I began to kind of look into, okay, what does people mean? Well, that's generally human rights in the supply chain. And then what does planet mean? Well, okay, it's going to be the materials that June were using in shoes. It's going to be, oh God, we should be measuring carbon emissions. I mean, I was amazed, I have to say, in your talk, Josh, that the idea of kind of being awareness of the damage carbon emissions is doing goes so far back. Nobody was talking about it. Even, when I kind of came to June, I said, we need to look at this and we need to care. So it's quite shocking that it goes back. So a lot of reading, a lot of looking at our competitors, a lot of podcasts, a lot of signing up to newsletters, and just reading. And then I think probably the thing that I did, which kind of tipped me into a place where I was able to convince the board at June, was I did the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Business Management course. And I think what that did was Josh has just done it all for you. Basically, it gave me some of the history of this, but also it gave me the language that I needed to use. There is a sort of language around all of this. And I began to understand then why other brands were talking it in that way. It was based on the kind of UN Sustainable Development Goals and stuff. So I think that was probably the language I used was the most helpful thing there.
One of the things that stands out to me as you tell that story is how you've moved into a space that you've never had any formal training in, that's not particularly familiar to you. And I suspect there's probably a lot of people in this room who feel the same way, particularly those of us who have done their legal training, law degrees, maybe done their training contracts, want to get involved in climate change related work, and you're realizing that it's just never been part of the curriculum. I'm seeing a few nodding heads around the room, and it's scary, right? It's scary, and we feel a real lack of confidence because it's just never been part of the curriculum. Did you have those moments where you felt nervous, where you felt scared, and how did you deal with them?
I think it's slightly different. To me, the biggest difference between private practice and being in-house is once you're an in-house lawyer, you have to be a jack of all. You know, people will literally come to you with a piece of paper, the marketing team, and they go, there's embroidery on this shoe and it might come off and we want to say this, that, all right. And you say, how would I know it's all right? So I think I had the advantage of anyway, a lot of the time I was just winging it. I would be asked a question and I didn't have, the stitching department to go down and check with them. So I think I was able to just wing it. And I just, I was interested in it. So that really, really helped. I had the kind of, and I think also being opportunistic, I could see this was a risk to the business. So there was a business imperative for people to listen to me and say, this is an issue. These are all the reasons why. So I do think I had the advantage. I think when I look back at being in private practice, we all get terrified about stepping out of what we know about. And something I've always done is being a trustee of various charities. And I try to get other lawyers on the board. These companies are like, oh, I don't know anything about the law. So I guess if I'd one bit of advice is just be a bit braver. You have incredible skills, even as a relatively young lawyer. You don't only know about what you've qualified into, what you're currently doing. You've actually got really, really incredible skills.
Fantastic. Let's come back to ESG a little. ESG is increasingly landing on the desks of general counsel. Why?
So as I said, there's still relatively little legislation which affects small and medium-sized private companies. But it's really, the legislation is really beginning to bite for any listed business and for large UK companies. And the EU, they've got this Green Deal. They've gone slightly mad with their legislation. And there's very few UK-based businesses which are not trading in the EU. And I think it's just the amount of legislation that's coming down the line. And it's, sustainability still is often dealt with by sustainability managers within a company, and they're not really qualified to understand, okay, I've got to do this TCFD climate reporting. And they look at it and they go, okay, so it's a certain turnover and a certain number of employees, but we have branches in the EU. Does that mean we're affected by that? So I think they look for lawyers to work at, okay, does it apply to us? I think as well that companies are becoming aware of the risks of ignoring all of this. And believe me, there are plenty of CEOs who've just decided, actually, this doesn't affect my business, I don't care. But I think increasingly they're beginning to see that this is a risk to the business. I mean, as I said, I've moved into hospitality, and a lot of businesses are really seeing the impacts of climate change starting to bite. So if you're a hotel chain and you had all your bookings cancelled in Italy because of the heat last summer, or you're in Eastern Europe and you had terrible storms and rain and it's ruined it. So they're already beginning to see that. I think food companies are beginning to understand the impact on some of their food stuff. So I think hospitality and food companies are probably slightly ahead, but I think it's risk. And I think horizon scanning, lawyers are very good, aren't they, in January, sending out the what's coming in 2024. So I think a CEO or a CFO or a managing director gets that and they go, oh my God, that's deforestation. We use loads of. So I just think the legislation is the legislation on awareness is kind of growing, which is good for lawyers.
And so building on that, what is it that you think makes lawyers particularly well suited to helping companies with ESG issues?
So I think we really excel at ingesting a lot of information and then distilling the key points. I mean, that's really what we're good at. We can read 150 pages and then tell people kind of what are the main points. That's actually not a skill that many other professions have. And I think, as I said, there's not just a lot of legislation, it's EU legislation. It can be very, very difficult to read. But then there's a lot of reading around it and also being really good at questioning it. I saw something this morning talking about the CMA and greenwashing, and this was actually written by quite a small law firm, but they said the CMA have taken enforcement action against ASOS and Boohoo. And I immediately went, no, hang on, they haven't taken enforcement action, they are investigating them. So I think our ability to look at words like enforcement and investigation and understand they're different and not take things at face value. We're very, very questioning, and I think you have to be very, very questioning. Does this apply to my client? How is this going to affect my client? Does my client have operations in Canada? does my client have operations in Europe? So I think that, yeah, just the ability to take on a lot of information and kind of understand whether it applies to our clients or not. Or your clients, because I don't have clients anymore.
And what were some of the biggest successes then that you had in that role and in that capacity at June London?
I mean, the main thing, I guess, is talking of the G in ESG, is getting the board to take it seriously, to get the founder to understand. So particularly with smaller companies and medium sized, there's a bit of a fear and that kind of like, oh no, we do everything fine, we don't want anyone looking into it. So I think bringing the founder and chair on the journey was great, and the board, and actually getting them to take it seriously and invest in it. I think bringing together teams, so I think there really still is a problem between understanding that the finance team, the marketing team, the sustainability team, and the CEO all need to kind of be involved in this. Some of you may already know CSR, as it used to be called, used to be seen as an area of the marketing team. So in my case, the buyers would decide they're going to do an eco-friendly shoe. Used to be allowed to use terms like that. And the marketing team would come up with some really great slogans about eco-friendly trainer. And then the kind of the quality control or logistics team or the buyers, they just wouldn't be speaking to each other, and nobody would, again, back to why lawyer, because I looked at that and I was like, what is this acronym? What does it stand for? And have we got evidence that this is what's gone into the soul of that shoe? So I think, what I'm proud of is bringing the teams together and making them understand that they have to work together. So marketing has to speak to the buyers, and the buyers have to speak to the logistics and quality control team to understand if what we're saying is right. What else? Just the fact that June Group now has kind of ESG strategy and a look forward position, and not scaring people, making people understand that, God, I hate this phrase, but I've never come up with a better one, that it is a journey. Nothing is solved overnight, and making people confident with saying, we've started this is what we hope to do in the future.
And actually, just building on that, I think the very best lawyers are willing to share a bit of that risk with their clients. That's where we can add real value, right? It's going on that journey with them and being willing to stand next to our clients as they assert a particular and say that it is part of a journey, part of a progression. Flipping that question then, what were some of the challenges that you had, and not just you, but obviously the general counsel community speaks extensively. Where have you heard your colleagues in other places struggling with these topics?
I think once you've kind of done the baseline of what you should be doing as kind of general counsel work with the sustainability team, to really move the dial, investment is needed. And that is where you're going to come up against an issue. So if I think about sort of climate change, we've got to measure it, we've got to understand that will require investment. And I think that is a real struggle, which is why I think sustainability practitioners and general counsel working in this field, you've got to get friends with people and make them understand why it's important. And I think that is a big challenge, is going to the next step.
So bringing it back to those of us in this room, where are we most at risk of going wrong, do you think, when we're advising on ESG issues?
Favorite topic on Wednesday nights. I think the key thing is, know what your client's business is about. That is where people go wrong. So I remember in the early days, a well-known firm offered to come in and talk to us, and they were hopefully trying to get business from us. But they came in and they talked about sort of waste legislation, and it just wasn't relevant to June. And that was a half an hour of my life I was never going to get back. And actually, I would say that not just with my sustainability hat on, but with everything. I want to know about things which are affecting my business. So, greenwashing was important. That's, if we're going to be making, but if you were a lawyer and you're turning up to have a chat with me and you wanted to talk about greenwashing, go on the business website. What is the business saying about their products? Have you looked at their advertisement? What's the point coming in and saying, I'm really concerned about your ads, but you've never looked at an ad. So I think we have this tendency as lawyers to go, this is the law, and tell, just like a kind of a dump about what the law is. People are busy, particularly in-house lawyers and CEOs. How is it relevant to the business? And I think that's where a lot of lawyers go wrong. They just want to talk about the law. Actually, so much the laws are relevant. I mean, back to the point I made earlier, there's no point going into a company and talking all about TCFD, the climate reporting, if in fact that company doesn't have to do any reporting, because you'll scare them, they'll realise it's not relevant, and think, what was that all about? So know your client. I mean, I can't emphasise that enough in all respects, no matter what sort of law you know your client.
Absolutely. If you could encourage everyone in here to focus on one issue to really upskill on, to put them in a better position supporting their clients with ESG issues, what would you tell us to focus on?
I think it depends on the individual. So what I would say to you is find a topic that you're really interested in. So, you know, that could be renewable energy, it could be fashion, it could be sustainable agriculture. Find something you're really, really interested in and do as much reading, listen to podcasts, go to conferences, give talks in that area, because if you're interested, it will make it so much easier and your enthusiasm and passion will come through. So that's what I would say. Do what you want. You know, you might think, oh, it's all about renewable energy, but you don't have that sort of brain or background and you're not that interested. That's like pushing water up a hill. Pick something. And as Josh said, it affects everything. So it could be something, you know, as harmful as fashion, something highfalutin. And just, yeah, get skills up on it. Brilliant.
And then just to bring this Q&A to a close before I open it up to questions from the audience, everyone in here is going to sit down at their desks tomorrow morning and they're going to hear your voice in their head. What's the one message that you would like them to take away from this conversation?
So when I did the Cambridge Institute Sustainability course, we had a whole module on storytelling and, you know, this concept of make it sizzle. And at the time I was like, I don't want to do this, you know, it's all wishy-washy and what's it got to do? You know, I want to learn about the UN sustainability and everything. But actually, as I've come to realise, you know, lawyers will have lots of knowledge. That's what we're really good at. But you've got to have the sizzle in the story and the enthusiasm. And it's that knowledge coupled with your enthusiasm that are going to make you a successful lawyer. I hope in ESG, but in any field that you do, we live in, I don't know if you've all read the Homo sapiens book, but we are humans and we live in a world of stories, and lawyers are often accused of being a bit dry, and obviously legislation is a bit dry. So the knowledge is taken as read. You have got to be enthusiastic and you've got to learn to tell a story, because that's what's going to sell this stuff, particularly climate change, which a lot of people can't yet see. It's how you tell the story. So if you are a very dry person and you tell lots of dry stories, go and do some presentational courses, you know, do something about it. These soft skills are really, everybody will expect you to have the knowledge. That is not what makes you shine and not what makes you successful.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We have got like 10 minutes. There's drinks, we'll have a little break, but before we just pause, you have a proper expert here, not a fraudster like me. We've got 2 roving microphones. If anyone wants to ask Clara any questions, now's your chance. Make them as hard and complicated as you dare. Couple over here.
Hi, can you hear me? Thanks, Clara. Question for you. To what extent do you think it's important to integrate or internalize sustainability in your personal life in order to have an influence in the business world?
Yeah, that's a very good question and actually quite pertinent to me. Yeah, I guess it was important. So I used to cycle to work, which no one else did, and I'm vegetarian. And I think it did make people think that I lived my values. It also made some very cynical people think I was a bit of a hippie. So, and I really mean that. So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that it's quite difficult, isn't it? I don't like the way governments try to blame the individual and make it like if we all became vegetarians, this would be the end. We need a system change, right? So I think it can be useful because it gives you more credibility. But I don't think it's going to shift the dial if you're meat eating. SUV guzzling driver. Please don't be. Yeah, I found it quite helpful. But as I said, some people did think of me.
Fair enough. I think we had another question over there.
Thank you both for the very comprehensive.
We've got a microphone on the way just so people online can hear.
Thank you both for the comprehensive and very helpful presentation. Josh, you shared a lot of resources that you could look at for mission statements and goals that companies can look to reach. Clara, in your experience, a lot of these mission statements and goals you cannot calculate them. You can't calculate with them. They're not tangible. Sometimes they lack integrity. So in the business that you've worked in, how have you dealt with that? And how do you know if your company is doing well by ESG standards?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there were just some concrete steps that we took. So I'm actually not one for mission statements. I don't really know what they add, because in a company where there's manufacturing, there's so many different things you had to look at. So it was quite difficult with one mission statement. I think some things are very concrete, you know, like June joined SEDEX and AMFORI BSEI, which are ethical trading platform for supply chain. Other stuff like carbon was probably going to be really difficult unless we engaged a company. I think you have to gauge the company you're in, because some companies, CEO, you know, loves a strap line and loves a motivational quote and loves something to work towards. And I think, going back to my point about be best friends with the CFO, CFOs love to see black and white numbers and everything, and I think it is difficult. So it goes back to the sizzle of the story. You know, how do you convince the business that this will ultimately mean the business's reputation is protected? Very, very difficult to measure, because unless the reputation is damaged, how do you manage how successful you are? I think it is challenging in this area. Yes, sorry, no magic answers. I guess I would say try not to get too caught up in these mission statements at the cost of doing some of the work. And I've been looking at a lot of TCFD reports, and I could just weep. I'm like, you know, you paid a consultant probably £350,000 to write this report for you, and there's nothing happening in it. It's just all, you know, management consultant.
One point I would offer you is, are you familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative? So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is part of the United Nations, and companies can submit their carbon reduction plans to the SBTi, who will then certify if they think it looks sensible, realistic, measurable, and all of those good things. So just as one takeaway, if you are working with a company that's thinking about committing to a particular target or goal, the SBTi is a nice sort of gold standard to focus on achieving with the plan that you're looking to submit. Janetta?
Clara, you said when you were speaking, I want to know what issues are impacting my business, my company. Now, I wonder to what extent there are discussions in the boardroom in your company about the impacts that your business is creating, so the externalities. Because from my perspective, ESG is bringing the externalities inside. It's internalizing the externalities. And under CSRD, we know that there is double materiality. You have to look at your externalities, at the impact on the people, the planet. And yeah, I just wonder to what extent that discussion is already being had.
I think it's a very difficult concept, because I think even sustainability professionals just beginning to kind of, not just beginning, but that concept of, you know, we're not factoring the cost of human capital, environmental capital into our products. And I think they're change. I don't think businesses want to do that. I mean, I always say to my daughter, I always say to her and her friends, you know, the only reason you have a £5 t-shirt is because someone your age in India is probably a sex slave. You all right with that? And I think that is the number one issue with all of this. Businesses don't want to recognise that if they price their products according to the damage they're doing to the environment or to people's lives, they don't want to think about that, because you've just hit the nail on that. It's a problem. So no, I don't think businesses are thinking about that, because otherwise everybody would kind of bring manufacturing back to the UK. There are strong employment rights and strong environmental laws. We're like, well, we're not going to do that. It costs a fortune. And unfortunately, the public don't want to pay for the externalities either. I mean, people know what goes on in Shein, Shine, whatever it's called. They're still shopping there. They don't care. So yeah, it would be lovely if boards would do it, but I think governments are step in. And I don't know why would government step in? It's going to wreck the global economic system. She said cynically.
I just wonder, because what you just said, it almost says, when we talk about personal life in here, right? If we all chose to pay more, then you impact the business. So that choice is probably the most fundamental choice you can make, right? Because if I choose, I'm not going to pay those £5, I'm going to pay the price of 100, which means I'll have fewer t-shirts, which is okay because I don't need 100 in my wardrobe. Then your personal choice that you make at home is the most important one that will impact that business.
I agree with you, but I don't think we as individuals are doing that. It's more like education, and governments have to force us, because people just, we're a bunch of people in here interested in this. But yeah, I mean, it would be a matter of educating people. And I really do feel strongly about that, you know, personally, people should be buying better things, but it's not the reality.
Hi, thank you both. So this is a question directed to both of you. ESG as a phrase has attracted quite a lot of criticism in the last few as a flawed concept. And I just wondered if you had any views, personal or professional, on the future of ESG as a term, whether you think it will be split out, consumed by something bigger, or just, I don't know, abandoned completely in its current form.
It's hard to know, isn't it? Because I think so CSR has fallen fashion. I think ESG probably would fall out of fashion. Although in a way, ESG was, I think Josh said, came about through sort of financial institutions. It wasn't really something applied to private companies. Now more private companies talking about it. And I think it will attract a lot of criticism. You probably all know there's quite a big backlash against ESG. So maybe people will feel the need to talk about something else. But I do think it's kind of semantics. I think we'll come up with it's quite hard to come up with these words. You know, so whoever comes up with the next one should trademark it around the world. I think ESG as words will probably fall out of fashion. I think we are seeing a bit of backlash to what underlies that, but the problems are so real and they're growing that no matter what it's called, I think it's here to stay, and businesses are going to have to deal with it.
So there's a lot to unpack in that. Some of the criticism of ESG is not complete. Okay, so there was quite a famous, are we allowed to say tweet these days? Some time ago, when I think it was Elon Musk was complaining that Tesla had been given a lower ESG rating than ExxonMobil, right? And that comes down to your understanding of ESG and the lens through which you are seeking to use the term. And I think that's where some people have a problem with it as a concept. The other challenge with ESG, particularly around the social, is it's very hard to break some of those social components down into numbers and statistics that are easy to compare as between business and industries, so that if you want to work out who is doing the best, you know, by reference to whatever ESG criteria, you have an objective basis for your decision making. But I think those are teething issues, actually, and I think they will be worked through. I don't personally think the term ESG is going anywhere. I certainly don't think the substance is going anywhere, and I care far more about the substance than what we label it. The business community has long since understood by now that those businesses which focus on ESG issues and perform better in the ESG space will, over the longer term, outperform their peers that do not pay attention to this topic. So call it what you will. I don't care so much about that. I do sort of tongue-in-cheek always say never trust an ESG because there's no, right? ESG is 40 different topics. No one's an expert in all of them. Of course, they're not. What you can have is a 40,000 feet overview of most of the topics and the ability to speak to them for 5 or 10 minutes in a reasonably knowledgeable way. And it's not unlike being a corporate lawyer. I don't know if we've got any corporate lawyers in this room, but the skill of a great corporate lawyer is you look at a merger and acquisition, for example, and you understand at a high level the 50 different areas of the law that are going to be relevant, and then you go and get your colleagues to comment. So I think that the term I personally think is here to stay. The backlash essentially is only in America, and it's more political than substantive, I would say. And I suspect that over the next few years, it will start to quiet down, particularly as people realize that even though businesses are sort of removing themselves from these initiatives ostensibly, they're still thinking about this stuff. They're still taking all of these issues into consideration in their investment decision-making processes. So I sort of get a little bit irritated by the conversation, only because if we spent as much time working the problem as we did arguing about the terminology, we'd probably be that much further down the line. So for what it's worth from me, I suspect it's here to stay. I don't have a better term. And just be careful how you use it and think about the context in which someone who uses it when they are speaking to you is intending to use it.
I mean, I think back to Larry Fink, I think he's really pulled back now. But you can bet your bottom dollar, because he's a very astute investor. He is looking at his portfolio and he is thinking, what's going to happen to this company because they can no longer, grow corn here, or this company because we can't transport these goods around. So he may not use ESG to separate himself, but he is looking at these companies that are affected by these issues and thinking we need to do something, and he'll be putting pressure on his companies.
Yeah, hearing substance, not form. Can we take a question from online before we go to? So this is from Tiffany Lura, and I do apologize if I've mispronounced your name. So Tiffany asks, how do we get businesses and law firms in the UK interested in ensuring that their business practices consider Indigenous rights and environmental protection issues in other parts of the world?
Janessa, do you want to comment that? Okay, so there's no easy answer. The human rights angle is the best angle in that I am aware of that is immediately understood by most lawyers. And it's also relevant to our clients, particularly as we frame those issues as business risk issues, right? Boards are open to conversations about potential risks. And if their business model is at risk of human rights abuses, then they will be aware that there are reputational risks there and financial risks there. And that approach to the conversation will create the space in which I think businesses are more willing to engage with these issues, particularly as NGOs are increasingly well-funded to go after businesses that are not taking these issues seriously. And actually, law firms are increasingly willing to help on the cheap because more and more lawyers are becoming concerned about this. I think what's interesting when you look at the question from the perspective of law firms is that I think law firms that don't focus on these issues properly are going to start losing some of their best young people very, very soon. And I think when that starts to materialize and people are leaving wherever they're at to go and work at more purpose-driven organizations, I think that's when it's gonna come home. Is unfortunately, as always, when it hurts the bottom line. But just asking the question and young people speaking and making time to go to events like these and saying to the partners that they work for, I went to a training session last night to focus on environmental issues, will spark those discussions amongst the partnership and hopefully slowly drive change. Perhaps not as quickly as we would like, but it's progress, and that's a start. Have you got any thoughts on that, Clara?
Hi, thank you both. That was really very interesting. Josh, what would you say to the recent tractor protests that have been going on in Europe as a kind of backlash, maybe not against ESG as a term as we understand it, but more against the kind of onslaught of European regulations that are coming in, imposing more stringent regulations about what farmers can do, which kind of goes to the point about system change and how that can come about, and whether that can come through a kind of state enacted legislation, or whether it needs to be more kind of ground based. I feel this kind of plays into sort of cultural wars that are going on now, and the fact that you still get a lot of people saying, especially boomers, saying, oh, well, the environmental movement, look at the 70s, that's old news, nothing new under the sun. There's been so much progress lately with standards that can be seen about what has been done to eradicate poverty all over the world. So that just goes to show that to an extent greed is good. And that kind of plays into that whole movement. How do you reconcile those two sort of opposing? And is it true that I like the idea of getting a good story and making it sizzle can overcome those difficulties? Who is best placed to do that?
Do you want to try that one?
I'm not quite sure what your question is. What would you like us to sort of answer in all you've said? What's the
It basically, sorry, it wasn't a very good clear question, but do you think that GCs as head of companies can have a role in that, and lawyers advising them can have a role in bringing those issues to the fore and bridging divides?
I think it's too strong to say we can bridge a divide, but I think because we are able to look at all the legislation that's coming and look at the business and warn the business, then we are part of the solution, because governments are trying to enact legislation. And all right, so the CSDD supply chain thing has been delayed. Who knows what's going on? And I think a lot of it is political. But something is going to happen, isn't it? So it's, there's going to be a version of that. And again, I guess it goes back to, your sort of legal voices for the future. You have a vote. I would like to think a lot of what's going on politically is representative of a certain age group and demographic now. And as more people come through with a lot more awareness, that they will vote with their feet. That is my hope, that we are seeing the tail end, I hope, of a desperate group of people trying to hang on to their wealth. And, it's like all of our politicians now, they're in bed with all the oil companies. Why are they approving new fossil fuel licenses? Because their pensions are all wrapped up and they really care about it. So I think, look, if you're a GC that only cares about, making millions and working for fossil fuel companies, you can do nothing. If you are coming with knowledge and enthusiasm about some of these issues, you're playing your part. What more can we ask?
I'll tell you just for 2 minutes a personal story, and then maybe we'll pause for a quick drink and then a break. So 2 years ago, when I was about to quit, actually McDermott, fabulous firm, I was just tired and taking a break. I was off to go traveling for a year, and I happened to be in Milan, where I'd been working on a criminal trial, speaking to Richard Swallow, who's one of the most senior partners at Slaughter. And I was already at that point becoming really concerned about climate change and environmental issues. And I said to him, Richard, I feel like I can work as hard as I want as a white-collar crime lawyer for the next 30 years, but it's not going to make any difference to climate change. And I feel like I'm wasting time here. And he offered me some extraordinarily good advice. He reminded me that, firstly, to be a solicitor is an extraordinary privilege. People will open doors for you and listen to you just because you are a lawyer, before you've even started speaking. More fundamentally, there is no job anywhere out there that I'm aware of that will get you in front of boards of companies more regularly than being a solicitor, right? Whatever kind of lawyer you are. And that gives you the opportunity to share the message that you want to share, right? You can address the mandate that you have been given, advise on whatever it is. But once you're standing there in front of them, right, you have their attention. And just to go back to where I was before, if you know how to speak to them in their language, if you know how to signal the messaging in and create a safe environment in which boards can take positive steps to drive environmental progress, to drive progress on social issues, then my belief and experience, limited as it is that the vast majority of senior business leaders will be very willing to have that conversation because they want to do the right thing. But being on a board is difficult. Most people on boards have a finance background and accounting degree, and they know business strategy and operations. They have been required over the last 10 years to become experts in GDPR and then bribery and corruption, and now ESG, and it's exhausting, and they're tired. And if we learn to speak to them with compassion and in a way that says, we're not here just to persecute you, we actually understand, let us help you realize value here, protect the bottom line, enhance your reputation, they are open to those discussions, and you will not find a job where you have more opportunities to have that conversation. So for what it's worth, I think absolutely all of us in this room have the ability to drive change. And I think that's multiplied by general counsel because they're on the phone to the CEO every 2 hours. Clara, thank you so much. Would you just join me in giving Clara a round of applause, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I know there are a few more questions in the audience, but we're going to take a break now. If you could just flick to the next one, Josh. And before we do that, the wine was actually cracking. So we have water and wine. It's quite biblical with any other options, but please do help yourself. And MW has very generously provided those. And thank you so much to both of you for a really informative discussion. But in the meantime, I have a few questions and requests for our brilliant members. The first is that you'll see on the chairs around you, there are some feedback forms, and there are some pens scattered sporadically around as well. There are fewer pens than there are paper, so pass it on. Feedback's really important for the leadership committee to be able to keep refining the way we host knowledge sessions, and to be able to understand your needs and better respond to them. It's also feeding into a conversation that we're having with another initiative called Law Street Charter Accountability. That's the acronym you'll see in the form. Also, you'll see on the back of the forms, there's a copy of barcodes. We are a non-profit. I mean, we don't take money. We have no source of income. But we do have operational expenses that we are currently funding out of our own pocket. So we do have a fundraising page. It's called Buy Me a Coffee. We're not actually asking for coffee. We just want your money. We'd be very grateful for any donations, one-offs or subscriptions, or can pay £1 every month, and it goes a really long way. I promise you this isn't going into our pockets. It's just paying for things like Eventbrite fees and sometimes Zoom fees. So all of the boring admin stuff goes on behind. So any donations are most welcome. And this is the QR code, and it could take you there. If you're not already a member, please do become one. You get access to wonderful things like members only webinars. And you should all know where our LinkedIn is. That's where we do our comms. If you want to host your own knowledge session, if you could just next slide or the next one. Okay, no, never mind. It's at the end. If you want to host your own knowledge session, here's a form. And all of our knowledge sessions are on YouTube, or most of our knowledge sessions are on YouTube. So if you can't attend in person or on the night, you can catch up for all of them. So without further ado, please help yourself to drinks, and please stick around for the creative content, because it really is always one of the most exciting and stimulating parts of the evening. Thanks so much all, and please don't sneak out and don't steal the pens.
Oh, thank you. It's so hard. I'm with no, I'm going to take seconds, but yeah, I didn't it was not fun. Yeah, I didn't know why. I'm anxious. Oh,
I doubt we're gonna have. Yeah.
But I'd like to.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, like she said.
It's very that it will slightly
I especially request I've been on for so long, and I'm like, 30 so maybe you're like tired of. I know. I just have no idea. So I never found it. And my master. No, I'm not.
That's quite interesting. There's so
framework.
I was. I read afterwards, like that's not my and not my first time, but on the very where will we I could have actually less clients. I don't I know that's not the work. But I just find it a bit. Thank you so much. But then I'm like, that's so true. Yeah.
That's why everyone's saying.
I'm gonna go in.
We're listening.
So challenging. No, but
Okay. I'm just gonna catch one up. So, yeah. Get it down.
that's my like.
Every lecture is what you should do. I was actually. Yes, I should. I should, yeah. Not much speaking. That's the best I've ever done. It's some people. When did you do it? Maybe 30 seconds. I think it's good.
I think that's so good. I mean, we were.
I was like, maybe.
It was still. Yeah.
But it's also like this,
I'm not going to be very helpful.
All right. Yeah. Great.
Everyone, can I invite you just to grab your drinks, take your seats? We'll power through the last little bit of the programming, and then we'll have another drink. Yeah.
Oh no, probably not.
Oh, go for it. Yeah, you be the bad guy.
Hi, everybody. If we could please start making our way to our final part of the knowledge session, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, everybody, we'll get started in the next 30 seconds. That was a fake fact, but there we go. I realised I forgot to say what to do with your feedback form. I will come round after the creative content session and just collect them. So please do fill them out. Thank you. Thank you for giving me yours directly. That's really helpful. And I'm going to hand over to Josh, who'll be leading the creative content session.
Thank you very much. Can you guys still hear me? Is my mic still working?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to stay seated because it's past my bedtime and I'm tired. This is a wonderful book that I would highly commend to you, perhaps second only if you haven't yet read it, to Braiding Sweetgrass. Please go and pick it up. We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. Actually, I listened to it the first time I read it, and I loved it so much, I bought myself a copy. In the main, it is a book about the impact that the global food system has on climate change, which I suspect is a topic that a lot of us are quite familiar with. Depending upon what you include in the calculation, what we eat accounts for about 25% of global emissions. And one of the most impactful things that each of us do right now to reduce our carbon footprint and drive that positive systemic change that Clara was talking about is shifts towards a more plant-based diet. If you're interested in those topics, this is a great book. But this book actually goes some way beyond just talking about that. And it looks at broader issues like how we perceive the climate change problem and what causes inaction. And he really spends a lot of time focusing on that theme. I hope that you have all had a chance to read the extract from the book that was sent to you. If you haven't had a chance, don't worry, there's plenty of copies floating around. But one of the later chapters in the book is called Dispute with the Soul. And it is a narrative of an argument, a discussion that the author essentially has with himself. It is inspired, perhaps somewhat unhappily, by what is historically considered to be the world's first suicide note, which is referred to as the dispute with the soul of one who is tired of life. It was found, I believe, in ancient and translated as best as we are able to translate those things. And that text sees the author grappling with his alter ego, his consciousness about whether or not he wants to live. In the brief extract that we've given you from this book, Jonathan Safran Foer wrangles with himself and whether he thinks he is doing enough, whether he is hopeful, how he's going to manage his fear, whether he should feel guilty about enjoying climate change because it gives him the opportunity to write a book. And I think those are probably feelings that are familiar to most of us somewhere in this space. We are terrified by the scale of the problem, its complexity. We wonder what we could possibly hope to do as individuals to make a meaningful difference. Sometimes we just wonder whether it's too late. So what I'd love to invite you to do is come together around our wonderful facilitators. Facilitators, can you stick your hands up? Cool. So our facilitators will sort of spread out amongst you and use the next sort of 10, 15 minutes to have a discussion of what are the things that go through your head in your darker moments when it comes to the climate change space and conversation. And I would invite you to use the text as a bit of a jumping off point to think about how can we recognize those feelings? How can we get a grip on them so that they don't overwhelm us? And actually, how can we use them as a springboard for something more positive? So I don't know, facilitators, do you want to sort of spread yourselves out to the four corners of the room and then people can bunch up around you? It's just creeping up on 8:15 now at just before 8:25. Come back to here and perhaps one person from each group would just share a couple of thoughts and ideas and then we'll get straight back to the drinks. Off you go. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. Can I explain that about?
Are you
I mean, in theory. Hi.
Sometimes helps if you make some to discuss. You guys.
I think there's another pulling
Okay. Information.
Hello. Nice to meet you. Oh, sorry.
Get a coffee, I've got a couple.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Okay, you coming?
So you go to affirm
So did I.
But that's the other thing.
I had. But my dad bought me
like 2 or 3 minutes. First interaction ever. That's the worst day. 100%.
Oh, very nice.
I need to.
Sarah.
And you repeat.
It's like 20% off food.
Everyone extra.
I do know about lunch and
Oh,
stuff, so
okay.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you have.
I got stuck in a
actually,
meeting.
and I think that's
Really
fine.
tough day as my room.
That's the I would say spare earthquake. But yeah, it's that much. And I guess we can discuss why there's a lot spare when you find about the climate. But one idea I have is the problem of such a big scale. It will start. Yeah. It should be. We can see it. Speaking of this, that would be heading now. Positive emotions.
No, I think so. And I
Okay, so there is the they want to
educate.
and then
how do you
department
But it's
know about climate? But I think the problem
across
it's almost too big for like brain.
Up when I.
I don't know. How do you address the severity of that thing? In a sense of what's I don't want to hear what's happening or impossible. How do you
I just think
put it in a way? But I think that this
literally just
what's your name?
try and grapple in the same way that we want to grapple in this dialogue. Probably that you have some concern about climate
last year
change, what's happening in our planet,
and
yeah,
job is
just go around or
take
sort of note
Okay.
how we feel and how I think probably all that
water conservation.
climate change together.
So
Go out and
so like
what the dialogue has.
work on ways how to manage waste management, air business, test of air and because
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think one of the dialogues that I often
that's
Oh, so they get the data
realize
because you are the supplier and they
that's kind of important.
like this
Will be shaped by
and so for example
and that
orders
I was
Whereas
all the switch
to
make it impossible.
harder
If our company we make it and then you sit down and like like
and then shoot.
they have to meet some standards.
yeah they have some kind of
How sort of balance
regulation
that
so all we I was very like
same humanity
as
I
a
don't
friend
have
very
something
starting I think there's no burden on me. It's crazy for tax not with no effect of no from it's
how it was
That's
in development and they just
very
best much cost like really what investors come to that's I was centralized the only sometimes like never I'm walking I just haven't imagine that kind of thing but I just pull in I will be my when
there are
then I think that's
Doesn't nature comes up with a design that it will
At least
that is not
that
was very
I suspect that's fine.
Yeah.
and what people do
Like kind of.
and
okay. I should just I always confuse two because I have I felt and the planet is
It's a natural.
which I had but because of the
Like that would be that would make
Actually,
sense.
you know what?
Yeah, with a virus.
because the
And then I
like sometimes our scissors which is scissors
living
So is that
yeah very much here
It was necessary.
I also take my foot like by off that
what did it say?
I saw him smell like you don't see it's very inside.
But it's still bad.
I no, it's not powerful.
That's quite sad.
And so
That's an point because I work in the
a friend that in the direction and instead of fighting the one I think this direction
lot of time.
very supportive as to the decentralized 200 is pointing at block 100 one and all that then higher I say there's no as five that I need to listen to and I will there is my does becomes part of the
Yeah, we should do
comparatively I don't need to fight with
About other because we I kind of trained like we're already my first time.
I didn't say
Alice and
and what do you think?
like the I'm fairly glad it's or like I don't know that directing
Yeah, I very much get it. So I'm
so I sort of have the education or island
actually
that's my
which
experience.
so I know where
It doesn't matter.
but
might as well have a chicken sandwich. At the moment I haven't dealt with any
through organized or by the
I don't think it's the system. Oh yeah, it's like the baby probably like the pilot.
so there's a thing about these two backgrounds I don't science degree they know how to do as long as they want and I'm not great
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's I think that's a
but as long as they and now
It's a bit of a
so it's actually going to suffer
so I think we've already proved
the back is what makes the lawyer because when the system collapse I have like
I think it's that
the
they're
industry
talking
itself
and like that.
they don't even know
The state was
the right so
Yeah, I'm like,
they are
But then
streaming
what if
now and about
I would like to.
like working
Yeah.
yeah, that's a signing process. Like how they
there's a lot but as long as you have access
and good at land that land's workable as well.
but it's and then
of our clients
No matter
and me clients
I would stop
social spectrum.
and taking
sorry go on like
This is your 60-second warning. 60-second warning.
I don't know
Pretending to be teaching.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of
You smile or have
I'm nervous
well
that
I've been
a lot of the
also they all have different amount okay I have
yeah.
it's a lot of
I guess
classic questions
it's more about I don't know. I think I again
like I
fiber
We've only got
which
direction them out.
those are actually then because the fibers of our wash they can't much
How do we tell that to CEO? I know. I love that vibe. I know the CEO has that.
You know
Like,
what
you
I
in these.
apologize.
Yeah.
When I thousand
Some of them.
it's never
Would you like to take your
Yeah.
stick in your groups if you want? We'll only be 5 minutes if you want
Yeah.
to say in your current relationship. Let's go with it.
Oh yeah.
Anyone
You want to post you in like last
Just bring all of this to a close then before we head back to the wine and then hopefully on for a drink somewhere else perhaps. Would anyone like to just share a few thoughts? There's no pressure, there's no stress. Anyone wants to just share?
Can I start?
Please.
I'm selling a show, but I think this is important because I know a lot of people experience climate anxiety. And I used to as well, and I no longer. And I think that's really important journey to share. And it's actually, some of you will know this story because I take it from indigenous people that I traveled and stayed with. So in a lot of indigenous cultures, there is this paradigm of a trickster. And just bear with me, it makes sense, it does. And a trickster in these, when you look at indigenous cultures around the world, it's either a very cunning animal, like a raven, or a fox, or a semi-god. But a trickster is a person that comes to trick you out of your ways of doing. So if you're not listening to like subtle messages, he comes to show you that what you're doing is actually not the only way of doing things. And an example I can give you is, if you thought that you can't live without consuming, the trickster would come and he would close all the stores. He would make it impossible for you to shop online or banter with your friends and family. And then he would sit down and look at you and be like, what do you do now? And what you would do, probably, you would create. You would create your clothes, you would, grow your own food. Now, you could have a deja vu. Because COVID-19, according to a lot of indigenous philosophies, has been our trickster. Because COVID-19 showed us, for example, that, do you remember Zooming with clients before COVID-19? Because I don't. There was like no way to Zoom with your client. Now we all are on Zoom, right? So trickster is that kind of idea of showing you the alternate way of living. Now, what if we saw climate change as a trickster? What if you saw climate change as your friend who has come to trick you out of your ways of doing? Climate change is not here to kill us, to kill the planet. The planet has been here longer than we have, right? So we are not saving the planet, we are saving ourselves. But I think the reframing of climate change as a trickster, as your friend who is showing you the direction of travel. And what I mean by it is, it's showing you that centralized energy is not the only way of sourcing our energy, because there is something like solar that can be completely decentralized. And when you adopt that paradigm, which really helped me, when you see climate change as a friend, you stop fighting it. Fighting climate change, addressing climate change, that's not what I do. You listen. You start listening to the message of climate change. What is climate change telling me is the direction of travel? Where should I go? You start looking for the signs. And instead of fighting, you start listening. And listening, right, Josh, is the best way of communicating. So that's what we shared. That's what I shared.
I love it.
Thanks.
Who wants to follow that?
Yeah, I've been asked to relay a thought that I brought up with the group. To when we hear all the headlines that get us down, because we discovered that a new study is showing us that we're like a lot more fluctuated than we thought we were last week, or whatever. Like a thought that often goes through my head at those times. I don't know to what extent is the wisest thought to have. And I don't know to what extent it's going to work for everyone, but what might help is to think of it the way Han Solo thinks about going through the asteroid field. Never tell me the odds. Just get on with it. Yeah.
anyone can top that with a Star Wars themed pun, I'll buy you a drink later. Come on, someone over that side finishes up, and then we'll almost be there. I'll take you. Thank you, mate.
Hi, everyone. So when we did our initial sharing, I think the general conclusion that we reached was that everyone felt some level of climate anxiety. So one thing that I shared as an anecdote from what I heard at another event recently is about how some cultures view these large issues such as climate change not just as an issue that you have to solve in one generation, but you see it as an intergenerational issue that you solve over the course of time and over the course of generations. And I think having that mindset helps to alleviate some of the pressure that you might feel as an individual to have to change the world within a day or within the lifetime, but actually recognize that in order to achieve this large systemic cultural change that we need to adequately combat and overcome climate change as humanity, everyone just needs to play their part to move the needle so that as you go from generation to generation, you're able to pass that baton down and achieve a more just and more sustainable society. No, that was fun.
For what it's worth from me, I also used to lie awake at night. Really, for hours, I'd wake up panicking and terrified, and I don't anymore. There are so many reasons to be optimistic here. To share just one thought, humans are brilliant at achieving impossible things, right? Just pause and think about that for a moment. It is what we do. It defines our species. The moon is 384,000 kilometers away. Okay, just try and wrap your head around that, and then realize that 12 people worked on it, and they got there using 1/100,000th of the processing power that you now have in a standard iPhone, right? And they didn't do it because they had to do it. They did it for fun, right? Just to see if they could. They raced to get there, right? Our ability to survive as a species didn't depend upon us landing on the moon. It didn't depend upon us decoding the periodic table. It didn't depend upon us recreating nuclear fusion in a lab using laser beams. It didn't depend upon us splitting the atom. It didn't depend upon us decoding the human genome. But we've done all of those things, and we've done them for fun, right? Just to see if we could. And we can do this too. And actually, we have the technologies that we need to do it right now, right? This doesn't rely on any great, future innovation that may or may not come. We've got a long way to go. We are in deep trouble. We are in deep water, but we can do this. And for what it's worth from me, when we humans put our minds to something, more often than not, we are going to do it, right? And we will do this. I am absolutely confident. The world in 30 years' time, when, please God, we're raising our children, is not going to look like it does today. But I don't think it's going to look like the Sahara Desert, right? I don't. And once we find our way to zero, we will create the space for future generations to start to fix it. And if by the time we retire, we have achieved something close to that, then I think we've left our children with a chance to go back 15 slides at sustainable development, right? And that's not too much for them to ask. It's the least that we owe them, and we can do it. And for what it's worth, the thing that most made a difference to me and helped me sleep at night was taking action, was doing something. And that doesn't have to be a grand thing. It can be small. It can be small steps. It can be talking about issues. It's as simple as coming here tonight and being part of the solution. So, yeah, look, we could do this for a while, and I'm happy to have this conversation later over a drink with anyone who's struggling with it, because I've been through it, and there's plenty of us in this room who have, and there's lots of wise counsel amongst this audience if you're struggling. Thank you all so much for joining us for this session. With Sarah's blessing, I'd just love to tell you just for 60 seconds about a project that I'm working on at the moment. No, I didn't. Oh, I did on my email address. So as of yesterday, I can officially share that from the 4th of March, I will have a new law firm open, Genart Law. What I'm hoping to achieve one day is a full service law firm that practices every aspect of the law through the lens of climate change. I've told many of you about it already. If you'd like to hear more, please come and grab me in the pub or find me on LinkedIn. But hopefully it will help to spark some of those positive changes that we're talking about. And with that, I'll kick this back over to Sarah.
Thank you. I really don't have much else to add apart from there's still some drinks, and also we've got a space booked to the Wood and Shade pub around the corner in Liverpool Street. For all of those who want to continue the party, it sounds like Josh does. So if you want to chew his ear off a bit more, then please, that's the place to do it. And I just want to welcome everyone to join me in a huge round of applause. I can't do it, but you guys can. So clap extra loud for me. Thank you, everyone. Really got out of my reception. I don't know if they can hear me, so that may have fallen on deaf ears, but for this amazing event, thank you so much, everyone.
I promise we'll be out of here by 9 o'clock, so we've got 25 minutes to have a few drinks, and then we'll go somewhere else for those who'd like. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So,
First strikes back.
Yeah. No, I like
They're in the flying in.
I'm pretty sure I remember
And CGPO counts that the odds of them surviving. No, it says so. And so
No, not lawyer.
never told me you.
Yeah.
But they sit actually.
I think I'm gonna hit to without the sign off. Create some cartoon out of face. I'll send it to you. So just yeah, no.